Why is it that in a time where mental health awareness has been preached from the rooftops for a number of years, especially in the last, let's say 7 to 10 years, that we're seeing mental illness on the rise exponentially, especially in young people? Now, I don't think this is any kind of magical coincidence. I think this is a byproduct of us falling away from God. But moreover, I want to explain my experience with quote unquote mental health, my experience being cured from quote unquote mental health, and experience with psychiatrists, therapists, etc. And I think for the most part, therapy is actually diabolical in nature, and in fact lends itself to the perpetuation of mental illness due to uh, people being enabled to continue to think how they want to think, that it has actually perpetuated these patterns, these thoughts, these behaviors in their own lives. Now, of course, there's going to be a lot of people saying, well, hey, you sound very insensitive. How dare you say stuff like that? Listen, there are people that have legitimate mental health issues. Of course, I am aware of that. And my prayers and thoughts are with them. And that I pray that they, receive some kind of relief, revelation, etc., graces to overcome them. Because that's not to say that mental health doesn't exist. But there's something really strange about how much we talk about mental health, but then at the same time, there's this upward swing of mental health cases. I mean, I think a lot of exorcists have said that most uh, cases of demonic oppression and possession are due to, quote unquote, mental health, but really it comes down to habitual sin. Sin makes you stupid, as you can see from the t-shirt that I'm wearing, which will be available here soon. But that's not the point. What do I think the cure is? What would put most therapists out of business? It's pretty simple, and I'll start with myself. For my whole life, I thought that I was dealing with, mental health issues. Now, there were a lot of circumstances outside of me that lent itself to these types of thought patterns. I wasn't raised with my father. I came from a broken home. I wasn't really properly catechized. I was on medication quite early. I was on all kinds of antidepressants, benzodiazepines, so like anti-anxiety medication like Xanax, Ativan, you name it. I self-medicated with alcohol, drugs. I've touched on this, very many times, but I lived a life rife with sin. And it was no coincidence that living that kind of life lent itself to all kinds of mental issues. And I found myself at the bottom of myself. And although I professed some kind of belief and faith in God, I realized that this was not enough. This profession of faith was not enough. Although there's a lot enough for most people to get their foot into the door. They recognize Jesus as Lord and King of Kings. But that must be followed up by actual action and aligning ourselves with what God actually calls us to be and calls us to do. And there's a famous quote by St. Augustine that you made us for you, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And although this is a kind of a popular quote, it's thrown around a lot, there is much truth to that. And so growing up, I dealt with all kinds of anxiety issues, depressive episodes, suicidal ideation. There was a period of time where I went through harsh panic attacks over and over and over and over again. So I say this with a degree of sympathy towards those that are still struggling with this. And then something happened. And this is where I think most therapists would be put out of business. So I remember I was going through a period of time where I was drinking a lot of alcohol. And this was in sort of peak COVID times, and this sort of alcoholic period of my life. It started in my earlier teens where I drank my grandfather out of his wine in his wine cellar, where I literally broke the door open. And in my early teen years, like 15, 16, 17 years old, I was, drinking all of his wine, getting plastered drunk, writing all kinds of really diabolical and evil, suicide notes where my family would find me passed out drunk. This is a real story. And I say this with a heavy heart because I feel incredibly remorseful for having put them through all of that. But nevertheless, I had a conversation with a therapist early on in my life, and I said, I suspect I'm going to be an alcoholic. Well, that kind of came to fruition in a way where end of 2019, I went through some kind of a breakup, what have you, went on vacation, and it came back, and the alcoholic habit came back with a vengeance. And it came back with such a vengeance that for the next 3 or 4 years, I would drink myself into a stupor, hard drugs, alcohol, fornication, etc., living a life that was a complete affront to God, incredibly offensive to God. There was a point of time where I was drinking 3, 4, 5 bottles of 101 proof bourbon and somehow still running a business, somehow still somewhat functioning, but barely, kind of hanging on by a thread. And of course, throughout this time, there was suicidal ideation, there was depressive episodes, there was anxiety, etc. And through that, I remember having a conversation with a therapist in 2020, and he was actually a great therapist. He was a secular therapist, and I mean, the good ones are few and far between. Let's be completely honest, especially the secular ones. Um, but he had a conversation with me, and he said, "Mike, well, why don't you just try not drinking?" And this was so offensive to me at the time. How dare you? I'm struggling with this addiction. And again, I have sympathy towards those that have addictive tendencies who have struggled with addiction, because I have for sure. So this is not to say that this is sort of like the cure-all, because some people legitimately have a problem. I know I've said that several times, but it's worth saying because I don't want to come across as like I'm being genuinely hateful or, holier than thou. I certainly am not. But I do think I want to present a helpful solution or a nudge in the right direction, that let this be a reminder to you in case you forgot. And I'll get to that point. And I was so offended by this because, hey, I'm mentally ill. I'm dealing with this problem, and you give me such a simple suggestion. Well, I mean, the suggestion is powerful, and in there kind of lies part of the answer. But anyways, I continued on my merry way, and I continued to drink, continued to drink, continued to use drugs, and again found myself at the bottom of the barrel, each low getting subsequently lower and lower and lower and lower. And that was and throughout this whole time, mind you, I professed a faith in Christ. I had all this Catholic imagery tattooed on my body. I said that I believed in Jesus, but the way that I was living certainly was not in accordance to how God, Jesus Christ, wanted me to live. And that was until, zoom ahead, I'm a couple years into marriage. I begin to get this revelation of the Catholic faith. And then I realized, okay, well, I haven't received my sacrament of confirmation. I stopped going to Sunday school when I was, however old I was, 10, 11, 12 years old, whenever that happens, to the youth now. So I need to receive my sacrament of confirmation. Now, through this time, I was still drinking here and there, right? I was still dealing with this kind of crippling anxiety, this existential dread, bordering on panic at times. And, a large portion of my life was also spent, smoking a lot of marijuana, by the grace of God. I've been able to quit that as well. And then I went to my first general confession, where, for those of you that don't know what a general confession is where you sit down with a priest for 45 minutes to an hour, and you basically confess the last 5, 10, 15, 20 plus years of sin. So it's been that long since I had been to confession. The last time I'd been to confession before that, I was quite young. It was after I received the sacrament, I believe, and I never went back. You can imagine having to sit there and to confess 20 plus years of horrific sin was quite humiliating. But that is exactly where the healing began. And I remember walking in to speak with Father at the time, incredibly nervous, a nervous wreck. After that confession, though, I left, and it felt like I could have floated to the heavens right there and then. And since then, making confession a regular part of my routine, which is a part of mortification, really, mortification being a sub-virtue of fortitude. I didn't realize that at the time, that I felt my ability to shoulder the burdens of life and anxiety and being a father and all of these things. It's like I was infused with this strength. And at the time, I realized I was re-infused with the theological virtues, and I was on my way to really cultivating the cardinal virtues: fortitude, temperance, justice, prudence, temperance. Maybe I already said that, and all of their sub virtues, there being some 64, 68 virtues, depending on how you count them. And I didn't realize this at the time, but I was essentially subordinating my defects to my intellect, in not an inadvertent way, in a very advertent way, but I wasn't aware of the intentionality at the time. And so I say that all this to say that after returning to confession and regular confession and praying a rosary daily, all of a sudden my wanting for alcohol disappeared. My wanting to lust disappeared. Keeping in mind, there were years and years and years I was a fornicator, and I watched pornography, and I struggled really badly with erectile dysfunction. And I know I've said this many times, but I think my platforms exist in a way to humiliate myself. So there is an opening for those that were like me, that felt like the prodigal son, that felt like the fallen away sheep, for them to be evangelized, to come in, to say, hey, listen, the church is not for perfect people. The church is a hospital for the sick. And I was deeply, deeply, deeply sick. And I firmly believe that after returning to the sacraments, returning to confession, and especially regular confession, and now intentionally trying to grow in virtue through various acts of penance and mortification and having a robust interior life, although I could definitely use some work in that area as well, and actually being aware of trying to grow in virtue and doing things that are intentionally pleasing to God, this anxiety, this panic, this depression, this wanting to participate in activities that are really bad for my soul have caused these mental illnesses to essentially vanish. That my conclusion is that most mental issues that we see today are a result of habitual mortal sin. And people aren't aware of that, but the more that you live for your feelings, you live for yourself, you're selfish, you want to self-soothe, whether it be with food or sex or alcohol or drugs or any combination of those things, the more you want them, because the more that you subordinate your intellect to your defects, the more you're disordered. Sin makes you stupid. Sin darkens your intellect, and it lends itself to more behavior that is disordered, more behavior that lends itself to the exacerbation of all of these issues. And so this video is not just one to humiliate myself as a man, again, to make that little opening for the other fallen away sheep to come through, but is also to remind you that if it's been a long time since your last confession, go to confession. I truly believe, and I'm not the only one to speak about this as well. Many more, much more intelligent men have spoken about this. Bishop Fulton Sheen has spoken about this. Of course, Father Ripperger, this is whose quote I'm wearing on my shirt. It's Father Chad Ripperger, Father Dan Rehill. A number of theologians in history and in modern times have spoken about that mental illness and the lack of virtue in somebody's lives or somebody's life. These things are linked together. And the more you see a culture that is rife with fornication, the more you see a culture that is rife with self-pleasure and self-soothing, you see a culture that is just infected with diabolical oppression. And we name that diabolical oppression mental health, mental illness, mental health awareness. So why, with all of this mental health awareness, is there more mental health issues happening? I truly believe in the majority of cases, it's because of perpetual sin. And that's not to say that everybody is demonically or diabolically possessed or oppressed, but there's certainly a level of oppression happening. And really, it is self-oppression. The more people fall away from the sacraments, the more that we remove God from society, the more we remove repentance and penance and mortification from society, the more that we see a disordered culture come to the surface. When I started to do these things, when I started to mortify my flesh, trying to be aware that all of my actions, my thoughts, my words, trying to align those with Christ, the suffering on the cross, with trying to humiliate myself. And again, going back to that phrase that I used, that I got from Father Chad, was subordinating my defects to my intellect. The more I found these issues fell away, and that my stressors in life are, of course, partially due to concupiscence and being, post fall. Of course, we all deal with like the pangs of sin and original sin. But the more I see these mental health issues fall away, completely fall away. So I firmly believe that if more people attended regular confession, regular partaking of the Eucharist and communion, regular mortification and regular penance, that their mental health issues would disappear. These things are hard. But I say this to all my clients, and this is kind of like a quote that people kind of like quote unquote know me by, and they make fun of me for, which is, whatever. They're fully justified in doing so, because sometimes I sound like a soundboard and I repeat the same things over and over again. But you either choose your hard or hard chooses you, and the hard that chooses you is infinitely more hard than the hard that you choose. The hard that we should all choose is the heavy weight of the cross digging into our shoulders, us trying to drag it uphill, trying to humiliate ourselves, trying to mortify and practice penance and build a robust interior life and practice of faith by going to confession, doing all of these things, then the hard that chooses you, which is oppressive to the soul and destructive to one's life. And I firmly believe, again, that if more people attended confession on a regular basis, I go either every week or every other week, not because I'm in habitual mortal sin, but that I realize that our grace is bestowed unto me in the sacrament itself. Even with venial sins, the graces that have come from that in terms of my anger or me bridling my speech or any number of things, I've felt these tangible improvements. I've experienced these tangible improvements on a week to week, day to day, month to month, year to year basis. But it's not just the act of going to confession, but it's also being hyper aware of my actions. And then again, trying to live in accordance with not how I feel, but how God wants me to act in all things, in all interactions, and in all situations. And what's interesting about that too is that the more that you go to confession, the more you are aware of your sin nature, and the more that you want to subordinate that sin nature, the more that you want to grow in virtue. So what we see in society today is fundamentally a lack of virtue. We see people wanting to indulge in their concupiscible appetites and then be surprised that they're experiencing mental and spiritual warfare. Guys, go to confession. If you're not Catholic, begin the process in actually inquiring and understanding what Catholicism teaches about the sacraments and about mental health. And I promise you, the results that come from it, you won't fully understand until you experience it for yourself. But take it from me, a guy that spent some time in a brief intervention unit. It was one level under the psych ward for a whole weekend. I saw mental health. I've experienced what I thought was mental health issues that seemingly disappeared after returning to confession, regular confession, partaking of the Eucharist, and the awareness that I need to grow in virtue and align my actions, my thoughts, my words with Christ. That's it. Like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. Hope this was valuable. God bless you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.